Okay, if you are watching this video, this is going to review adding fractions, and we kind of got started on it yesterday, but I feel like we are missing some key information. First of all, I'm hoping that we realize that a fraction is a part of a whole. It is a piece of something, and there's a million different ways that we can portray a fraction, but every fraction is composed of two things. So we should know by now that the top number is the numerator and the bottom number is the denominator. And these are parts of a whole thing. So a half isn't a whole, it's a piece of something. And I know that yesterday we talked about, like, on a number line, if we have the number 1 and the number 2, we talked about how are there any numbers between 1 and 2? Are there any numbers here? And we realized and decided that yes, there are actually an infinite amount of numbers, because those are what fractions are. These are pieces of a whole. We're in between 1 and 2, that is a fraction, it's a part of something, as is like a decimal. So we talked about how we could split this up into half, or into thirds, or into fourths, or we could split it up into all these little teeny tiny things, and we can cut it however we want and make a fraction pretty much out of anything that we wanted. And we also talked about how as we make the numbers go, 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5, as the numbers get bigger, the pieces actually get smaller, and how a fraction can go as far up as you possibly want. I could have 1 and 450 over 453. I could have millions. I could have thousands. Whatever it is, it's a piece of something. We also talked about how we had some terms that we knew from 3rd grade that we wanted to review. So we talked about the idea of fractions being equivalent, and how in the word equivalent, the root is equal, and how an equivalent fraction are two fractions, like a half. I have a number line. A half is in between both, but I also could split it into fourths, and 2/4 would also fall in the same exact spot. They look a little bit different, a half, 2/4. They have a different denominator, so it's cut up differently, but the same amount of that thing has been taken up. So they are equivalent, they are equal, they're just represented differently, okay? The other word we talked about that you should have remembered from 3rd grade is simplify. And that kind of goes back to these. These two are equivalent, but one is in simplest form and the other is not. And we simplify fractions because it makes what we're doing a lot easier. We don't call the pizza place and say, can I have 2/4 of my pizza with pepperoni? We don't speak that way. We speak in equivalent in simplest form. So in this version, 1/2 is the simplest form of 2/4. They are equivalent, but one is simple and one is not. Okay, so we're going to practice this and come back to it. The only thing that's also coming back from other chapters, we'll be talking about words like least common multiple, greatest common factor. So I'm hoping that as we go through this, it will be also a review of some of those old terms that we need to keep coming back to because they will show up. First of all, here's what we're going to do. When we are adding fractions, if we started in 3rd grade, you guys add things like 3/5 plus 1/5. We call these like fractions because they have the same denominator, which actually makes them a lot simpler to add. If I have 3/5 of something, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I have 3 and I want to add 1/5 to it, I can add a 5th to that because a 5th looks like this. These are all the same size, so I can add them together. They are like fractions. So it would be like adding, if I have a dog and Mrs. Markleff had a dog, we would have 2 dogs. Those are like things. They have something in common. They have a common denominator, which means we can add them. We don't add the denominator because a 5th is like a thing that you can hold in your hand. We have 3 of those things and 1 of those things, and together we have 4 of those things, which would be 4/5. Now in 4th grade, we are moving towards things being more complicated, where we are having unlike fractions. That would look like if we had 1/9 plus 2/3. So everyone should write this down in your notebook, whichever way you would prefer. And we're going to talk about these. These are unlike fractions. One of them is a 9th. So again, if I have 1/9, there's 1/9. And if I have 2/3, I cannot add them together because they are not the same thing. So I'm going to give you an example actually like in real life. If I have 1/2, and I would like to add 1/4. I cannot add them because a half looks like this, and a fourth looks like this. If I put them together, they are, I don't know, what would I even call that? I can't call it 1/2 fourth. It doesn't make any sense. This is a half. It's an actual thing I can hold. And this is a fourth. It's an actual thing I can hold. I cannot add them together. So instead, what I have to do is realize that I need to change one of the fractions so they have something in common. So if I go back to like an example that I think kind of makes some sense, is if I have a dog and Mrs. Markloff has a cat, together we do not have 2 dog cats. That doesn't make any sense. They don't have something in common. We can't put 2 things that aren't the same and put them together. Instead, we have to find something that they have in similar and call them something else. We're trying to find like a like term that they have. So my class came up with they're both animals. So I could say I have 1 animal and Mrs. Markloff has 1 animal. And together, we have 2 animals. There's another way to say it is the idea of pets. I have a pet, Mrs. Markloff has 1 pet, and together we have 2 pets. These would be like terms for the other original words we were using. We've changed them so we can add them together. We're going to do the same thing with our fractions. So if I have 1/4 right there, and I have a half, and I want to add them together, I need to find something they have in common. This is where like chapter 2 stuff comes in about factors and multiples. We're going to think about multiples. I have the number 2, and I have the number 4. I need to find something that they have in common. This is where I'm thinking if I skip count by 4s, and I skip count by 2, I should be able to see some things they have in common. I'm noticing they have 4s in common, and they have 8s in common. Ideally, I'm going to find the least common multiple because I want to find the simplest thing that I can add together. And I'm noticing that 4 is the least common multiple. So I think that I can change my half into 4ths. That means I'm going to keep my 1/4 the way it is, but this half I need to make into 4ths. I'm actually just going to cut this in half so you can see it. Because if I have a half and I want to make it into a 4th, I'm noticing that in order to make this half into 4ths, I need to multiply it or split it by 2. And if I do that, and I take my thing and I split it in half, I'm noticing that now, if I want to make my 4ths, if I had 1/2 and I'm splitting that into 2, I now have 2/4 because I've multiplied it. And I had this one thing together, now I have 2/4 here. 2/4 plus this 4th, now together can make 3/4. These are all the same size. They are all the same thing. And I can add them and make a fraction. Does that make sense? This is Markham's here. Now we're going to practice and you're going to write in your notebook and we're going to see if we can solve some of these. So if I have my sticky note. Oh, here it is. All right. On your notebook, you're going to write down 1/2 plus 1/6. Again, these are unlike fractions. I have a half of something and a 1/6 of something. They're 2 different things. I cannot add them together. I need to find something they have in common. When I'm looking at things they have in common, I'm noticing that if I skip count by 2s and skip count by 6s, I'm already noticing that I have 2 things that they have in common, the number 6. So that is their least common multiple. I could also pick 12, but that's not their least common multiple, and I'll have to simplify, and that makes life a little bit harder. I'm going to choose the least common one to make my life easier. So I'm noticing that I can keep it as 6. That's what I want. That's the least common. Well, the bottom one's already in 6, so I can just keep it. I don't have to do anything. If I want to make a half into 6, then I need to think about what I'm doing to that denominator, the 2, to make it into 6. Well, I know that 2 times 3 gets me to 6. And whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do the top, because if I'm changing the way it's cut, then I'm also changing how many things are actually colored in. And I would end up with 3/6. So I'm going to show you like a visual. If I originally had a half and I want to make it, so here's my 1/2, and I want to make it into 6, and I'm multiplying it by 3, that means I'm cutting each thing into 3. And now look, I have 1, 2, 3 colored in, out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 total colored in.
But we didn't actually change the amount colored.
The same amount. These are now equivalent. 1/2 and 3/6 are equivalent fractions. I'm making equivalent fractions so I can have like fractions so I can add them. Now I can add 3/6 plus 1 6, and that gets me 4 6. Now what's really tricky is you have to start thinking about, are the fractions I'm adding actually in simplest form? So this is where factors come in. Your thinking is there something, you want to make it simpler. If we make things simpler, we make the numbers smaller, I guess. So we are looking at 4 and 6 and
You
thinking.
want the least number of pieces.
So if I have number 4, like what are the numbers that can go into 4? I can split 4 into 1 times 4 or 2 times 2. And 6, the factors of 6 are 1 times 6 and 2 times 3. And I'm looking, is there any factors that they have in common? I'm noticing that they both have 2. So that means that I can simplify these by dividing them by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3. And this answer to this problem in simplest form is 2/3.
A fraction is only in simplest form if the two numbers, if the numerator and the denominator, have no common factors other than 1.
So the factors of 2 are 1 and 2. The factors of 3 are 1 and 3. The only common factor is 1. Well, that's not helpful because anything divided by 1 is itself. So I know that this is in simplest form because they don't share any other common factors.
The way you'll know you've got to simplest form is if there's no other number they share that we can divide by, then we know we're in simplest form.
Okay, I want you to pause the video, and I want you to see if you can do this one by yourself. Press play when you're ready. All right, 2/5 and 1/10. I'm hoping that we realize that 2/5 of something looks like that, and 1/10 of something
Looks something like that.
yeah, it's hard on the smartboard. And there's 1/10. They don't look alike. They're not the same size. These are really tiny and these are big, so I can't add them together. They have to be the same size. So I'm, again, thinking, well, what do 5 and 10 have in common? I'm hoping that we're realizing that if we skip count by 5s and we skip count by 10s or find the multiples, that automatically the least common number they share is 10. So that means that I can make my denominators into tenths. So I'm going to make my 5 into tenths. Again, in order to get from a 5 to a 10, I'm multiplying by 2. That means I'm cutting all of these into 2.
You cut them into 3.
I cut them into 3. Oh, no. Hang on. Let me redo that. 1, 2, 3,
4, 5.
I'm not good at this.
Yes.
2, 3,
I was about to
4,
catch
5.
you.
Okay. I had how many? 2? So now I need to cut them in.
So one line.
There we go.
There we go.
Now that's intense. And so if I multiplied that, look at it changes. I now have tenths on the bottom because there's 10 total things. And on top, if I cut obviously the denominator in 2, that affects the numerator. And now I have 1, 2, 3, 4 that are colored in. Now they're in the same piece size, so I can add them together. 4/10 plus 1/10 is 5/10. Hopefully, sometimes kids think, like, oh, one's odd, one's even, so I don't have to simplify. That's not a thing. You can actually think about factors. The factors of 5 are 1 and 5. The factors of 10 are 1 and 10, 2 and 5. Oh, look at 5, 5. That means that I can simplify this because they share a common factor, which is 5. And if I simplify, I get 1/2. 5/10 in simplest form is 1/2. All right, we're going to try another one, and you're going to press pause. 2/3 plus 2/12. Now I want you to stop, think, press play when you're ready. Okay. 2/3 and 2/12. Unlike fractions, I need to find a common denominator between them. I'm hoping that we're realizing that if I skip count by 3, oh, automatically look at 12. And I know that 12's down there. If I skip count by 12, 24, 12 is also there. I'm going to pick 12 because that's the least common multiple. So that means I'm going to keep 2/12 because it's the actual denominator I want. And I'm going to change my first one so that it has 12 as the denominator. And I know that to get to 12, I need to multiply by 4. And I also changes my numerator. And that would get me to 8/12. Now I can add them. 8 plus 2 is 10. And I still have 12s. Again, these are both even, so that's obviously I know that 2 is a common factor, but I'm going to just double check to see the factors of 10 and 1 and 10, 2 and 5. And
if I automatically go with 2, I may find myself having to simplify more than once. 2 will always work, but you can sometimes simplify more than one time.
I am noticing that 2 is the greatest common factor. I'm going to divide.
So if it's not just a common factor, but actually the greatest common factor, I'm going to be able to get the simplest form in one step.
I do want to show you what happens if I decide to, instead of picking 12 as my denominator, what would happen. So if I decide that I have 2/3 and I have two 12s, and maybe for some reason in my head I'm like, ooh, 24 is a common multiple, and I decide that I want to change my denominators to 24, you can do that. That's not wrong. You'll just see what makes it tricky. So if I'm changing both of them to be 24, I know that I'm changing 12 times 2 is 24, and 2 times 2 is 4, and 3 times 8 is 24, and 2 times 8 is 16. And now I can add, and I would get 20 out of 24. Well, that's definitely not in simplest form. And like Mrs. Markov said, if you automatically are like, ooh, I'm going to divide by 2 because they're both even, that will work, but 20 divided by 2 is 10, and 24 divided by 2 is 12. Oh, well, guess what? They still can be divided and simplified. I would have to divide again, and I would end up getting 5, 6. I still get the same answer, but do you guys see how it took me like a couple extra steps to get there? That's fine, but if you find the least common multiple, it will be a little bit easier.
Greatest common factor.
Greatest common factor. I'm sorry, I'm missing them up. All right, I have 2 challenges for you, and then you're going to move on to extra practice. I want you to do 1/3 plus 1/4. Okay, stop, pause, see what you can do. All right, I'm hoping that we're realizing that this time I can't make a third into a fourth or a fourth into a third. Those aren't the same things. There's nothing I can do to change them. If I'm thinking about multiples, and I'm trying to find something they have in common, I'm noticing that actually 12 is the least common, and I have to change both of my fractions. Okay, so I want to make 12 the common denominator, but this time both of them have to change. I'm doing the same thing I was doing before, it's just I have to do it 2 times. So from 4 to get to 12, I have to multiply by 3, which means that my new numerator is 3 and my new denominator is 12. Then up here, if I get from a 3 to a 12, I have to multiply by 4, and my new numerator is 4. Now I can add 4 plus 3 is 7, and my denominator is 12. I'm going to check to see if I can simplify this. I'm noticing that 7 is prime, and the only factors of 7 are 1 and 7. And I know that 7 is not a factor of 12, so I know that it is in simplest form, and I'm done with this problem. All right, one more. Let's do 1/4 plus 2/5. I want you to stop, pause, and see if you can solve it. When you're ready, press play. All right, again, 1/4 and 2/5. They don't have anything in common. I need to find a common denominator. I'm thinking of the common multiples. And then the common multiples of 5. And then I'm looking to see what they have in common. And ooh, I'm noticing that 20 is their least common multiple. That means I'm going to change them to be 20 for their denominator. Now, from 5 to get to 20, I know I'm multiplying by 4, which changes my numerator to be 8. And from 4 to get to 20, I know that I'm multiplying by 5, which makes my numerator 5. Now I can add 8 plus 5 is 13, 20ths. And then I have to check to see if that's correct by can I simplify. Well, 13 is prime. The only factors of it are 1 and 13. And I know the factors of 20 are 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 4 and 5. So they don't have any common factors. So I know that this is in simplest form. Okay, here's what you're going to do now that you are done is you're going to look at the board, ask what you should be moving on to next. Hopefully you are feeling a little bit better about fractions. We are going to continue this, but I'm hoping we understand why we have to change and find common denominators and why we can't just add 2 unlike denominators. Okay, bye guys.